Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. So, for a while, I had wanted to do a video that included an interview I did with my father. I want to say 6 or 7 years ago. It was quite a while ago. I want to say, a freshman in college, and one of our classes had an assignment, which was to do an interview of a veteran for the Veterans History Project. For those of you who aren't aware, the Veterans History Project is a project put together by the Library of Congress, in which information is collected about different veterans, service records, histories, photos, and interviews. And so for this history class, we had to interview a veteran, and my father served in Vietnam. Didn't have to be a combat veteran, just worth pointing out it could be any veteran. And my father served in Vietnam. He was in the military for over 35 years, or actually exactly 35 years. And so I did an interview with him. Now, I will admit that I don't know exactly what footage is great for this kind of thing. Maybe a more entertaining kind of FPS would work better. But it's an hour, 50-minute long interview, and the only footage I have that really fits with that right now is for Order of Battle Pacific. So we're right now kind of in turn two of our, not turn two, but the second part, our second video of our Battle of Guadalcanal via Order of Battle Pacific, and I figured I would just kind of use the footage that I had on hand. So without going too much into more detail, I'm going to jump into the interview. My father passed away last year. I didn't want to do it right away, but this is kind of a tribute to him. I will warn you, this was done on like a little handheld cassette recorder, so the quality of the audio isn't great. In fact, I think you can hear the click, 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 click of the tape as it goes around and around and around. So again, it's not going to be great audio. Maybe a little bit quiet. I'll try and do a little bit of work to improve that a bit. Additionally, keep in mind that this was I was a freshman in college, and I thought it was really cool to be hearing some of these stories from my dad because, frankly, he didn't talk a ton about his military service, and a lot of these are kind of first time that I had ever heard him talk about it, and really the only time that I ever heard him talk about it. Not like a horrific war experience where he's like, I just can't talk about it. It just wasn't something that he talked a lot about. So without going into any further rambling here, because I'm already about 2.5 minutes into this video, I'm going to break the interview up into probably 3 or 4 parts, and post those into separate videos, probably all using the same footage, just for continuity's sake. So I hope the video of what you're watching is at least entertaining enough, and more importantly, I hope you enjoy the interview and the audio that I conducted with my father. So with that being said, let's go ahead and we'll jump into the interview.
Interview is being conducted for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. The location of the interview is at the personal residence of the interviewee. Could you please state your name, branch of service, years of service, and final rank for the record?
I served in the U.S. Army, Army Reserve, or National Guard from 1954 until 1989. And I retired as a colonel, full colonel.
Where's your family originally from?
I'm originally from Washington, D.C. That was where I was born and raised, actually in the city of Washington.
And how did you end up joining the military?
Back in 1954, I'd gotten out of high school in 1953, and 2 other friends of mine, George Gould and Paul Michel, we decided jointly, I guess, to join the National Guard. Seemed like a good thing to do, so we decided to join, and we did that in February of 1954.
When you first went in, were you intending for this to be a long tenure in the military, and did you go in as an enlisted man, or did you intend to become an officer?
Well, to be honest, when I joined, I was 18 years old, hadn't given much thought to the future. I'd just gotten out of high school, and no, I had not intended to stay in the military. Didn't know if I'd like it or not, but it seemed like a kind of a cool thing to do at the time.
Did you have any experiences in boot camp or whatever you went through for the National Guard to...
Well, I wouldn't say anything special. In those days, it was a little different the way it operated. Of course, I was an enlisted man, and I was basically a private. And in those days, they didn't have boot camp like they have today. So I went through my basic training right in my unit in the National Guard Armory in Washington, D.C.
All right, and I noticed that you ended as a colonel in the military, so how did you end up going from an enlisted man to becoming an officer?
Well, I served for about 6 or 7 years as an enlisted man. I got up to the rank of E6, or in those years it was called Sergeant First Class. That's a little different from what it is today. But I was an E6, and my company commander, Captain Hardy, approached me and said, you know, he thought I might be a good candidate for officer candidate school. So at the time, National Guard was just starting up an OCS program, and this was the second class that was going to go through. So I decided to do that or try that, and what it involved was going to a summer camp for 2 weeks at Fort Miles, Delaware, then doing a weekend a month during the year, and then a summer camp at the second summer camp is when you get commissioned at the end of your second summer camp. And that's when I was commissioned in 1959, as a second lieutenant in the Military Police Corps. This corps was my branch in the Army, if you will, because the unit that I was in at the time was a military police unit, even though my specialty was communications.
All right, and what kind of assignments did you have both when you were enlisted and after you got your commission?
When I started off as an enlisted man, my first job was as a wireman, which means I was one of those guys that put spikes on his boots and crawled up telephone poles to string wire. And then I became a senior wireman. Then I became a switchboard operator, where you operate a little military switchboard. Then I became a senior switchboard operator. And I eventually progressed. By the time I made E6, I became the chief of the communications section.
All right, and how did
for the military police unit.
And how did that role change once you got your commission?
Oh, it changed dramatically. Once I got commissioned as a second lieutenant, I became a platoon leader in a military police unit. And as a result, my primary job at that time was to provide leadership for my platoon of 48 men. And we performed military police duties, and it was my job to lead that group of men.
All right. Was there anything that stood out in your experiences in the National Guard? Anything that you remember in particular?
No, to be honest with you, I did seem to enjoy a great deal working with other men and providing leadership for them when I became initially when I was the section chief in the communications section, and later as a platoon leader in the military police battalion. I was, by the way, my unit was the Company D of the 163rd Military Police Battalion in the Washington, D.C. Army National Guard.
Okay. And when you became an officer in the National Guard, did you foresee at that point that maybe you would like to continue on and maybe even join the active military, or?
Well, I wasn't certain, to be honest. I had gotten married in 1958, and I was in a job, civilian-wise, as a printer, where I was making good money, but I really didn't truly enjoy it. So I had been a commissioned officer in the National Guard for about 2 years, and I began thinking about the Army as a possible alternative for me, going on active duty, that is. And just about that time, the Berlin Wall crisis came along, and it seemed like a good opportunity for me to apply for active duty, so that's what I did. I applied for active duty and entered active duty as a second lieutenant in June of 1961.
Where were you? What was your unit when you went on active duty, and where were you based?
I was based at Fort Benjamin, Harrison, Indiana, the 226th Military Police Company, where I was a platoon leader. But I also had jobs as the supply officer for the company and as an assistant, what's called a military police officer in the office of the Provost Marshal for Fort Benjamin, Harrison. The Provost Marshal is like the chief of police for a post. So I acted as a duty officer on occasion and went out and did police work with my men.
All right, and you've mentioned platoons and companies a couple of times. You said there's 48 men in a platoon. What's the makeup of a platoon?
A platoon typically is designed so that there are usually 4 squads of about 10 men each, plus there's a little platoon headquarters. So the platoons usually perform, in the military police arena at least, they usually perform duty as a shift. Like at Fort Harrison, my platoon operated as a unit, running a shift of 8 hours, and the other 3 platoons usually had 3 platoons on, 1 off at any one point in time.
So it's almost just like a police department might have a shift of police officers.
Absolutely, just the same.
All right. And were there any assignments that stood out when you were in Indiana?
Well, actually, what turned out to be kind of interesting, even though I performed those duties that I've mentioned previously, our unit had another duty which was very interesting. We actually were escort unit for nuclear and non-nuclear munitions being shipped throughout the United States, and we handled any munitions that were manufactured in what's called the Fifth Army area, which is kind of the Midwest of the United States.
And were there any incidents with nuclear weapons or non-nuclear weapons that maybe you...
Yeah, it was interesting. We traveled in a couple of different ways, actually 3 different ways. We flew, we went by train, or we went by truck. Typically, when we went by train, we actually billeted ourselves, or slept, if you will, in what's called a drover's car, which is like a big freight car with bunks in it. And the nuclear shipment, of course, we were on both ends of the nuclear shipment on the train, and we would take these train trips from Indiana out to San Francisco, where the munitions were then shipped to points. I'm not sure exactly where they were shipped to from there, somewhere in Asia, I assume. We also took shipments by air, and I flew on several occasions out of Madison, Indiana, where the munitions were manufactured, and these were not nuclear, these were non-nuclear weapons, and we took those down to the test ground in Yuma, Arizona, and the test firing range down there, and we flew in C-47s, which were 2-engine planes back in those years, just prop planes, of course. One of the more interesting things that occurred, one of the trips we were flying over the Rockies, and there were just 4 of us, the pilot, the co-pilot, myself, and an enlisted man with me. And we got up to the point where oxygen was required, and the pilot and my enlisted associate got a little lightheaded and had to put on protective masks, or I should say oxygen masks, whereas myself and the co-pilot didn't have any problem at all. So I guess different bodies react different ways. But we landed, I recall, in Colorado, and then took another hop from there into Yuma. And when we left Indiana, I remember it was in November, and it was about 30 degrees. And when we got to Yuma, Arizona, it was 96, and we were in our winter uniforms, so it was kind of warm.
Were there any incidents when you were transporting weapons by truck?
Yes, actually, only one really that stands out in my mind. We what we typically did is we had a military police car in the front of and in the back of the truck. The munitions were usually secured in the middle of the truck, and the truck always had not camouflage, but disguised names on the truck, so you wouldn't know exactly what it was carrying. And
not to interrupt, but what kind of truck were these?
These were like full tractor trailers
So
types
like
of trucks.
18-wheel
Yeah, 18-wheelers, yeah.
So they
And-
weren't actually military vehicles?
Oh, absolutely not. Now, as a matter of fact, I always had a man who rode with the driver, and they drove up there and they took turns because they weren't used to the long hauls, and maybe every few hours they'd switch over so that the driver would have somebody different to talk to, and the person riding with him wouldn't get their insides jumbled around too much from riding around on the truck. I recall one incident that was very interesting, and we were traveling in Indiana at the time, and we were heading to Joliet, Illinois, and it was we traveled all the time. We didn't stop, so it was in the middle of the night, might have been 2 or 3 in the morning, and we were traveling through a little town called Kentland, Indiana, which is on Highway 41, if I recall, and we got stopped. And here we were with 2 military police cars and a truck in between us. We didn't have our red lights on or anything because, you know, we didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. So this policeman pulled us over, said we were exceeding the speed limit. Well, I went up to him and I said, officer, that's not the case. And of course, as soon as I went up to him and we stopped the vehicle, my men, because we were carrying nuclear munitions and we were under presidential orders, my men got out and surrounded the truck. And the officer came up to us, and it was quite obvious to me that the officer had been drinking, which right away gave me kind of a bad feeling. But at any rate, when he insisted on knowing what we were carrying and I refused to tell him, I just told him that we were under presidential orders, he said, well, I'm going to look in the truck. So he goes up to the truck and he grabs the seal that was on the truck. And just about that time, my men, as if by order, and it wasn't by order, but they did it because this is what they were trained to do, all of them cocked their submachine guns at virtually the same time. Click, click. Just about that time when the officer grabbed the seal, and the officer then decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and he decided to, at that time, leave and say, have a good evening. And he did that, and we, of course, climbed back in our vehicles and proceeded on at that point. Kind of interesting, kind of fun, actually. In retrospect, it was kind of fun.
This is right around the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis. You said you
That's
were
correct.
active
I was at
May
Fort
of
Benjamin
61?
Harrison. Yeah, in '63, I think it was, when the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis were around the same time.
I think it was 62.
Well, I'm not sure exactly, but what did happen is that our unit at Fort Ben Harrison was alerted that we were going to provide military police services for a unit that was being deployed to Cuba. And again, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had no idea what was going to happen. We were scheduled to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and fortunately the situation was defused, and when it was defused, of course, everybody stood down and we went back to our normal duties at that point.
Right. Did you serve overseas at any point?
Oh yeah, twice, actually. I served from 1963 until 1966 in Germany, but actually, prior to 1963, I was selected to attend a course at Fort Holabird, Maryland, called the Imagery Interpretation Officer Course.
And what's that about?
Well, those are the individuals who examine photography, infrared images, and radar images to try to determine what's going on the ground. We used a thing called a stereoscope, and we examined photographs that were taken mostly in those days by U-2s to determine whether or not there were any threatening incidents taking place on the ground or anything happening that would affect U.S. forces. Now, that was just school. It was 6 months long. I finished up that school in May or so of 1963, and I assumed that when and I had orders for Germany, I assumed that when I went to Germany that I would go into a role that would use that imagery interpretation skill that I just learned. Well, the Army being what it is, I went over to Germany, and of course I went right into a military police role and never did actually have the opportunity to practice my 6 months of schooling. So in essence, that was a wasted 6 months.
That's interesting that you were training essentially to do what people had done a couple of months before in spotting the nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Well, that's the interesting part. As part of our schooling, we had access at the time. Of course, it's been declassified since then, but it was top secret photography, and we actually saw the missiles in Cuba. I remember San Cristobal as being one of the places where we saw those missiles, and we could definitely tell what was going on in Cuba. And we in essence were looking at it after they had been interpreted at the Pentagon, of course. But it was very interesting because it was something that was happening pretty much live, if you will.
All right, so when you went to Germany, you said you were put into a military police role. How was it different when you were in Germany to a military?
Well, different in a number of ways. First of all, I was stationed at a place called Kornwestheim, Germany. It's north of Stuttgart. It's outside of Stuttgart, West Germany at the time. And I was initially the commander of a unit. I was only a first lieutenant, and normally companies are commanded by captains. But I was the senior first lieutenant in the battalion, and was selected to command Company B of the 385th MP Battalion. And I did that for about 3 or 4 months, and basically was getting to know my role. My men were performing. In those days, there were just men. There were no women in the units in those years. But my men were performing military police duty for the city of Stuttgart for the military who were stationed there, and there were a number of thousands of soldiers stationed in and around Stuttgart. And we performed normal military police discipline, law and order functions in the Stuttgart area. As I say, I was just getting to know my men, and a captain was assigned to the military police unit, and as a result of that, I got bumped out of my command slot because I was still only a first lieutenant. So at that time, I became the motor officer for the 385th MP Battalion, where it was my job to oversee all of the maintenance and operation of all of the vehicles. And military police, we operated with Jeeps in those years, and we didn't have sedans or anything like that. So we had to keep them in tip-top shape, and all of my people were charged with that responsibility to do that. And then I did that for a few months, and then I was asked to go to the headquarters of 7th United States Army in the Provost Marshal's office. Again, the Provost Marshal being the Chief of Police, the Provost Marshal for all of 7th Army, and 7th Army was the major command for all units in West Germany at that point in time. So I became the administrative officer for the Provost Marshal's office. I was about that same time promoted to captain, and when promoted to captain, that didn't really change anything. But one of the interesting aspects of my job, other than managing the administration of the Provost Marshal office, I was also selected as the top secret custodian, which meant that I had access to all of the plans of 7th United States Army in Germany during that period of time, bearing in mind, again, this was in early 1964.
So you had access to all the 7th Army's war plans as
Yes.
a crisis hit?
Yes, and how the military police role worked for that. And then I'm not sure why exactly I was selected, but as an additional duty, I was selected to serve on what was called the Central Army Group Task Force, whereby I worked with my French and German counterparts in police planning under periods of if it came to war, if you will, in Europe, where we had access to basically all of the war plans. Central Army Group was the group that if you will, commanded not only the 7th Army, U.S. Army, but also all of the French forces, all of the German forces in Europe at that point in time. So a much broader role, and it was a very interesting job. I got to be very close with my counterparts in the German and the French, and actually unlike much of the stereotypical French, the French captain that I worked with was a very nice man. Le Commandant was his rank, and it was a very exciting, very interesting thing to do.
How did the European soldiers that you met with and European citizens, in the way you saw it, view the American military presence in Europe?
For the most part, I can only speak of Germany. France was a little different. It didn't have any U.S. troops, at least not any large number of U.S. troops. But Germany, of course, at that time had about 250,000 U.S. troops. I would say it was kind of a mixed bag. To some degree, on occasion, I got some very negative feelings from some of the citizens, but on the other hand, I got some very positive feelings. I would say for the most part, though, the Germans were somewhat neutral to the presence of the Americans at that point in time, because obviously we provided quite a bit of money for their economy, and they saw that as a positive. Some of the negative things our soldiers got involved in from time to time, and of course as a military policeman I ended up seeing those things. They weren't always as positively felt by the German people, understandably so. But one of the nice things that did happen is that I had taken German in both high school and the small amount of college that I had, and I had the opportunity to become a little more conversant in the German language. Even though in all of my 3 locations that I lived in Germany, we lived on American bases. Nevertheless, you rub shoulders with German society quite a bit. Not society, I mean the German people.
Was it more challenging keeping your men or the military over there in check, considering they were in a foreign country? Or?
Yes, because we had a thing called the Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA for short, which described what happened in certain kind of incidents, who would prosecute under certain circumstances, etc. And because the military was in a country that was not their country, we always wanted to make certain that we put forward as good an image as possible. And it was our job as military police to try to ensure that our soldiers didn't get too far out of line and give the United States an ugly American kind of image, even though, frankly, in that period of time, on a worldwide basis, especially in Europe, Americans had been seen to be arrogant and very selfish. And so we had to make certain that our soldiers conducted themselves in a good way, so that they didn't reflect badly on the American people.
So Americans at the time in Europe were viewed as fairly negative?
More negative than positive, I'd say.
Is that a result of the continuing American military presence in Europe, or?
Well, again, I think the Germans viewed that in a positive and a negative way. Obviously, we brought a lot of money into Germany through, our spending habits and whatever. But on the negative side is we weren't part of their society, and our men would go into the guest houses, and sometimes there'd be a ruckus in a guest house. We got involved in those from time to time, where we took care of the Americans and the German police took care of the Germans.
All right, so I hate to cut it off right there, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump in here. I know we're kind of in the middle of my dad talking about his military experiences in Germany. This is really going to be probably part one of, I would imagine, 3 or 4 parts worth of the interview. I hope it was enjoyable. It's a little bit of a slow uptick, I would say, going from his initial enlistment to kind of the early days that he was serving in the military, some of his experiences in Germany. We'll finish up with those German experiences in the next video, and we'll also look at, I believe by that video, we'll get into his service in Vietnam as well. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, this is just kind of a short little series I'm doing in tribute to my dad. Again, he passed away last year, and I've always really wanted to post this on YouTube, but I wasn't quite sure how to go about doing it. So with that being said, thanks again for tuning in, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please feel free to leave comments and what have you in the description. But other than that, I hope the audio was of reasonable quality. Let me know if you think there's any other mix work that needs to be done. Part of the problem is in this video, in this interview, I was speaking very quietly, or I was far away from the microphone, whereas my father was much closer to the microphone. And again, it was just a kind of a crappy little handheld recording cassette tape that it was all done on. This is like I said, 7, 8 years, more than that actually, maybe almost 10 years ago. Be that what it is, I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know your feedback. Okay, guys, thanks again, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.